This audiobook is brought to you by the team at Project Armageddon Conspiracy. The team consists of Josh Bingham, Samuel Einstein, and Daniel Groover. The aim of the project is to transform all Generation 1 Armageddon conspiracy writings into extremely high-quality text-to-speech audiobooks. We use a patented state-of-the-art AI voice engine system known as Mercedes. I am Mercedes. I am your narrator on this epic journey. From all of us at Project Armageddon Conspiracy, we hope you enjoy the ride. In hoc signo vinces. The hypnotized geniuses. In The Law of Psychic Phenomena, Thomas J. Hudson contended that humans had two minds, each endowed with separate and distinct attributes and powers, each capable, under certain conditions, of independent action. Alternatively, there is one mind that can operate in two distinct ways. The one mind is possessed of certain attributes and powers under some conditions, and certain other attributes and powers under other conditions. Hudson stated three fundamental laws of psychic phenomena. 1. Man has two minds. The objective mind, conscious, and the subjective mind, subconscious. 2. The subjective mind is constantly amenable to control by suggestion. 3. The subjective mind is incapable of inductive scientific reasoning. Hudson wrote, one of the most important distinctions between the objective and subjective minds pertains to the function of reason. That there is a radical difference in their powers and methods of reasoning is a fact which has not been noted by any psychologist who has written on the subject. It is, nevertheless, a proposition which will be readily conceded to be essentially true by every observer when his attention is once called to it. The propositions may be briefly stated as follows. 1. The objective mind is capable of reasoning by all methods, inductive and deductive, analytic and synthetic. JT. The objective mind is empirical, space-time oriented, temporal and contingent. It is a scientific mind. 2. The subjective mind is incapable of inductive reasoning. JT. The subjective mind is rational, singularity, non-space-time, oriented, eternal and necessary. It is a mathematical mind. Let it here be understood that this proposition refers to the powers and functions of the purely subjective mind, as exhibited in the mental operations of persons in a state of profound hypnotism, or trance. The prodigious intellectual feats of persons in that condition have been a source of amazement in all the ages, but the striking peculiarity noted above appears to have been lost sight of in admiration of the other qualities exhibited. In other words, it has never been noted that their reasoning is always deductive or syllogistic. The subjective mind never classifies a series of known facts and reasons from them up to general principles, but, given a general principle to start with, it will reason deductively from that down to all legitimate inferences, with a marvelous cogency and power. The subjective mind naturally pursues reason and logic, and naturally rejects scientific observation. It is in a sense blind to space-time. Inductive reasoning is predicated on observation in space-time. Without space-time observation, inductive reasoning is impossible. You cannot think scientifically if there is nothing to observe with your senses, no space-time patterns to compare and contrast. The straightforward way to reach and unlock the subjective mind is via hypnosis, which has the effect of deactivating the objective mind, and thus the objective way of thinking, perceiving and judging. Hudson wrote, place a man of intelligence and cultivation in the hypnotic state, and give him a premise, say in the form of a statement of a general principle of philosophy, and no matter what may have been his opinions in his normal condition, he will unhesitatingly, in obedience to the power of suggestion, assume the correctness of the proposition, and if given an opportunity to discuss the question, will proceed to deduce therefrom the details of a whole system of philosophy. Every conclusion will be so clearly and logically deducible from the major premise, and withal so plausible and consistent, that the listener will almost forget that the premise was assumed. Isn't that remarkable? Underneath it all, people are perfectly logical. They are all Sherlock Holmes. They can deduce perfectly. If people used their subjective rather than objective minds, they would master mathematics effortlessly. Look at how much unconscious mathematics occurs during sport. Think of tennis, where each player has to continuously calculate angles, speeds, prevailing conditions, the proximity and height of the net, the lines marking the court, spin, location of opponent, condition of the ball and racket, tension of the racket's strings, chord condition, chord material, grass, clay, ash, etc., and its effect on bounce, speed, and trajectory, and so on. The top players are mathematical prodigies, even if they know nothing at all about academic mathematics. Imagine trying to program an android to beat a top tennis player. Beating a human at chess is one thing. Beating them at tennis is something entirely different. Why are intuitives so much better able to grasp ontological mathematics than sensing types? It's because they are much more closely aligned to the subjective mind, hence the deductive mathematical mode of thinking. They don't get distracted by sensory data and induction. Can hypnosis be used to bring people much closer to their hidden genius? Colin Wilson wrote, Hudson was amazed when a fairly ordinary young man, under hypnosis, proceeded to hold imaginary conversations with philosophers and to create the most brilliant intellectual systems. Why isn't hypnosis routinely used in this way to free everyone's inner philosopher and mathematician? Carl Jung had an imaginary friend, a wise old man called Philemon, who seemed to be Jung's subjective mind transformed into another, separate being, with whom Jung, the objective mind, could converse. This is an entirely different take on Jekyll and Hyde. Jung didn't need to take any serum to release another being locked inside him, and the other being was no monster, but more of a guardian angel, mentor, higher self, or Socratic demon. Wilson wrote, Jung was astonished to find that his Philemon said things that he himself had not consciously thought. He had succeeded in producing an interesting form of self-hypnosis, in which the objective mind was permitted to enter the realm of the subjective mind. Imagine how different the world would be if everyone had their own Philemon on tap. If Jung could manage it, why not everyone else? Shouldn't we be aiming to release all the trapped Philemons? Let's look at the case discussed by Hudson where a professor hypnotized a young man and made him have conversations with famous dead philosophers, such as Socrates. The professor said, "It is true that Socrates is dead, but I can invoke his spirit and introduce you to him. There he stands now." The professor then pointed towards a corner of the room. Hudson wrote, "See, the young man looked in the direction indicated and at once arose, with a look of the most reverential awe depicted on his countenance. The professor went through the ceremonial of a formal presentation, and see, almost speechless with embarrassment, bowed with the most profound reverence, and offered the supposed spirit a chair. Upon being assured by the professor that Socrates was willing and anxious to answer any question that might be put to him, C at once began a series of questions, hesitatingly and with evident embarrassment at first, but, gathering courage as he proceeded, he catechized the Greek philosopher for over 2 hours, interpreting the answers to the professor as he received them. J.T. So, the student spoke questions aloud, then received replies from Socrates, which only he could hear, which he then relayed to the professor and assembled audience. His questions embraced the whole cosmogony of the universe and a wide range of spiritual philosophy. They were remarkable for their pertinency, and the answers were no less remarkable for their clear-cut and sententious character, and were couched in the most elegant and lofty diction, such as Socrates himself might be supposed to employ. But the most remarkable of all was the wonderful system of spiritual philosophy evolved. It was so clear, so plausible, and so perfectly consistent with itself and the known laws of nature, that the company sat spellbound through it all, each one almost persuaded, for the time being, that he was listening to a voice from the other world. Indeed, so profound was the impression that some of them, not spiritists, but members of the Christian Church then and there, announced their conviction that C was actually conversing either with the spirit of Socrates or with some equally high intelligence. The decisive question is whether the student was actually conversing with Socrates or running some kind of internal simulation of Socrates that was, seemingly, as wise as Socrates himself. An interesting point is whether Socrates replied to the young man in English, a language that did not exist in Socrates' time, or whether the young man heard Socrates in ancient Greek, a language the young man did not know, and effortlessly translated it. It would seem that Socrates understood English, given that the questions were posed in English. Hudson went on, at subsequent gatherings other pretended spirits were called up, among them some of the more modern philosophers, and one or two who could not be dignified with that title. When a modern spirit was invoked, the whole manner of C changed. He was more at his ease, and the conversation on both sides assumed a purely 19th century tone. But the philosophy was the same, there was never a lapse or an inconsistency. With the introduction of every new spirit there was a decided change of diction and character and general style of conversation, and each one was always the same, whenever reintroduced. If the persons themselves had been present, their distinctive peculiarities could not have been more marked, but if all that was said could have been printed in a book verbatim, it would have formed one of the grandest and most coherent systems of spiritual philosophy ever conceived by the brain of man, and its only blemish would have been the frequent change of the style of diction. Why are such feats never now undertaken? If the young man was in some sense making it all up, how was he able to do this so brilliantly and convincingly? How did he have advanced philosophical discussions, without himself being an advanced philosopher? Is this a potentiality of the subjective mind, to which we can all gain access? Hudson wrote, "It must not be forgotten that C was not a spiritist, and that the whole bent of his mind inclined to materialism. J.T. He was in his normal state a scientifically minded individual. He frequently expressed the most profound astonishment at the replies he received. Either C was receiving novel replies from a discarnate spirit, which would be astounding, or C was inventing the replies, which would be equally astounding, and then being amazed by his own inventions. Of course, if the subjective mind is, in effect, an autonomous, separate mind, then it would be as mysterious to the objective mind as any other mind. The difference is that this other mind, the subjective mind, is one to which we all have guaranteed access. It's our inner other, and it has abilities that could transform our lives beyond recognition." Hudson wrote, "This was held to be an evidence that the replies were not evolved from his own inner consciousness. Indeed, it was strenuously urged by some of the company present that he must have been talking with an independent intelligence, else his answers would have coincided with his own belief while in his normal condition. The conclusive answer to that proposition is this: he was in the subjective state. He had been told that he was talking face to face with a disembodied spirit of superior intelligence. He believed the statement implicitly, in obedience to the law of suggestion. He saw, or thought he saw, a disembodied spirit. The inference, for him, was irresistible that this was a demonstration of the truth of Spiritism, that being assumed, the rest followed as a natural inference. He was, then, simply reasoning deductively from an assumed major premise, thrust upon him, as it were, by the irresistible force of a positive suggestion. His reasoning was perfect of its kind, there was not a flaw in it, but it was purely syllogistic, from general principles to particular facts. So, all of these philosophical discussions conducted under hypnosis did not use any other form than syllogism. Since Socrates in real life actually used an argumentative dialectical method rather than any precise syllogistic reasoning, it's hard to see how such a process could truly reflect Socratic thinking, but it would of course be fascinating to compare and contrast all great philosophers and philosophies parsed through this hypnotic method. Imagine an education system in which students, under hypnosis, could be filmed conversing with the spirits of geniuses and engaging with the geniuses at their level, then having this material played back to them. What wonders could result from this process? The self-esteem of the students would lift off and reach escape velocity. They would realize what they were truly capable of. They could release the full power of their subconscious and change everything about their lives. Their new and enhanced reasoning abilities would alter everything about how they viewed reality. They would become much more logical and mathematical. The unconscious is the source of our energy, our creativity, of everything that surprises and amazes us. People become neurotic when there is too much of a gap between their objective and subjective minds. The objective mind, if it is cut off from the power of the subjective mind, becomes bored and struggles to find meaning. We need to close the gap. We need to bring the subjective mind much closer to consciousness.